Alright guys, I'm going to teach you guys a couple more things when it comes to doing some just basic drawing within Tahoma2D. What I want to talk about is adding what's called a smart raster layer. Okay. So normally if you have a level, let's say we have a regular raster level, okay, and I'm just gonna draw with a paintbrush here, and let's fill it with a color. Okay, so this is a regular raster layer. This is, you can tell it's a regular raster layer because it's blue. Okay, we can also create what's called a smart raster layer. Okay, the way that you do that is when you make a new layer, you would set type to smart raster layer. They will come through as green as opposed to being blue. Okay. When you have a raster layer, you have your set of colors, your styles that you created. Your smart raster is actually going to have its own palette that's a little bit different, so just keep in mind that if you have a color that you want to replace or change, you're going to have to do that. Make it again. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to make a new color, and let's set it to yellow. Okay, and I'm just going to kind of apply this color. And maybe I'll make a second color too. Let's make another color. And let's make it like a light blue. Okay. And I'll fill these in with it. With a smart raster layer, anytime you use a particular color, if you go later on and change this color, it'll automatically go back and update any place where you use that original color. So for instance, right now this is using my color 2, my yellow. I'm going to go back to color 2 and I'm going to change this from yellow to orange. You can actually see this all automatically updates. Okay. Or if I take this and I change it to purple, you can see that that all automatically updates. Okay. Now this only works with the color. It does not work with raster textures. So for instance, if I was to say use this brush, currently I have, let's say, set it to hatch lines in the example brushes, and I draw something. I'm just going to draw a couple lines here. If I was to go and change the color from black to, a different color, you'll notice that all of my strokes update in terms of the color. But if I was to change this from the hash line to anything else, like, I don't know, marker, you'll notice that although from then on I switch my texture, the old lines do not automatically update. Okay, so just be aware that the color will change, but not necessarily any sort of texture that's applied to your raster drawings. Okay, so why would you want to do this? Well, I mean, maybe, eventually we're going to be drawing things over and over and over again. So it's good to get, if we want to make changes to our color and not have to go back and, update many separate layers and many separate, items, this can be a good way to do that, is to use a smart raster layer and sort of have your main colors, like I could call this, instead of color 2, could be main color. So it doesn't really matter what color it is. It doesn't matter if it's orange or yellow or purple or whatever. It's just the main color. And if I decide later I want to change colors, I simply go back, and then all of the colors will automatically update in my scene. So that's just an easy way to do that. So we've talked about raster layers. We've also talked about smart raster layers, which are like raster layers in that if you make changes to them, they also will update. The final thing we're going to talk about is what's called a vector brush. Okay. So there's something called a vector graphic. You guys may have taken like the Digital Media 4 class where you've done this, where you've used programs like Adobe Illustrator or something similar to that. I'm going to use Figma because Figma is just easier to quickly use. I'm just going to make a graphic really quickly. And remember when we were talking about rasters, how everything in a raster graphic was based on pixels. Okay. Things that are vector-based are not based on pixels. Instead, they are based on lines. So I'm just making a complicated shape here. So if I zoom in on this graphic here, although it looks like these are pixels, these are not. And so the benefit of vector graphics is usually that because they're not based on pixels, vector graphics can be easily scaled without losing distortion. If you were to scale a raster graphic above its normal size, it usually will get just a little bit distorted because you're blowing it up. That doesn't really happen with vector graphics. So vector graphics can be easily scaled. The other thing about vector graphics is that if I was editing a raster-based image, I think I closed it, but if I was editing this is a raster-based image. If I wanted to edit things, we have tools like eraser tools and selection tools to, move things around, essentially. Vector programs like Illustrator, like Figma, like, other ones, they instead use something called an anchor, and they have segments. These are the anchors, these are the segments, and thus I can edit the anchors to change the overall shape of my design. I don't want to go too deep, and obviously if you want to learn a little bit more about vector graphics, I strongly recommend you take the Design 4A class, which will go deep into working with Adobe Illustrator and sort of, utilizing vector graphics and whatnot. So how this relates to Tahoma2D is that you can actually work with vectors inside of Tahoma2D. To do that, you have to have a special vector layer. So the way you create a new vector layer is click here and set your layer to vector. You can also go to level, new, vector level. That would be the same thing. Vector levels are always going to be purple by default. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab one of those geometric shapes, and I'm going to make a new color, and let's just set it to like red. Okay, I'll just call it red. And I'm going to click and drag. Okay, so I made my shape. Now what's different about this is that this is a vector. Okay. So the first thing is, if you scale it, it should not distort. This is a pretty simple drawing, but if I made something more complicated that was vector-based, it should, in theory, not get distorted. The other thing is that we can also edit those anchor points, just like I was editing the anchor points here in Figma before I closed it. Okay, the way you would do that is if you go down here, about halfway down, this says Control Point Editor, and if you highlight a shape that is vector within a vector layer, you then get access to the anchor points, and you can manipulate those anchor points, or those control points. Okay. So, you know, this allows you to sort of, if you have experience with vectors, this might be kind of fun for you. Another thing about vector graphics is anytime you draw anything with a vector, with a brush, and you update that particular color, it should automatically update anything that used that same color. So here I updated this from red to purple, and then everything automatically turned purple. So it's a little bit like the smart raster layer, but it's kind of you know, in that whatever color you build, it'll automatically update. Okay. There's a couple more options we can do, or a couple more options you get with the vector that you don't get with raster layer. One is that up until now, if I've wanted to have a fill color or a fill item, so for instance, I'm making the color yellow here, and I can kind of like fill in this, you know, shape here. I always fill with a solid color, a solid, you know, yellow or something like that. Vector graphics or vector layers allow you to fill with what's called a texture. A texture is a design that tiles over and over and over. So this is like some stone. You can see I can fill in with the stone, or the sandpaper, or this tartan type design. You can even actually load in your own file if you wanted to. So if you wanted to load in a file, you could load in you know, you could load in a bitmap file into your textures to work with here to have additional options. So those are just a couple more options you can play around with. There we go. The other thing is, you remember that when we were dealing with the raster layers, we had like these raster textures, you know, that would kind of change our default sort of style of our brush from, you know, just being like a circle into something with a little more texture. Well, we can kind of do the same thing here with the vector layer. So make a new layer. Let's make sure it's a vector layer. And let's make a couple of colors here. So if I was to use a brush and paint, just get these kind of solid lines here. What I could do is click where it says vector, and go down and say where it says vector brush. And you can see it gives me, these are kind of the same in that it gives me kind of a different texture. So now when I draw, I get this kind of wiggle line, or you can play around with these different types of brushes. Okay. If you change the brush type, all of the brushes that got applied here will automatically update. In addition to using different brush types, there's also these kind of like custom styles. What this would do is when you apply it, it like, you know, takes whatever the pattern is and has it follow. So like if I do this line here, these leaves will follow that line, or flowers, or ice cream cones, water lines. So you can create some interesting things. There's also some patterns, so if you don't want your line to just be a solid line, you want it to be more of a pattern. I'm just going to make another new vector layer here. And under generated, I'm going to click on the one here. So now when I draw, I get kind of this shaded line, or not about that one, but this one's kind of a blocky. It's called tull. These hash line marks here. Alright, and also all these are just kind of interesting. You get some slightly different effects, and you can always change the base color. This is red, but if I change it to purple, you can see the effects. They're also still vectors, which means that they're made up of these anchor points that you can still manipulate. So I'm selecting the anchor points and manipulating the line even after I drew it. And of course, you can still always edit things by using like an eraser tool. Or just selecting things. Note that using the selection tool won't work because that is more of a vector-based tool, but you can select independent lines and move them. But you won't be able to like take apart a single line. That's more what this control point tool would do, where I can edit the parts of it. Okay. Or you can just highlight the whole line. Just delete it by hitting the delete key. Alright, why don't you try that out?